Before we go anywhere else, hear this and let it settle in your spirit. You will not lose this battle. You were not created to be defeated. You were created to overcome. What you're facing right now is not the end of your story. It's the proving ground of your faith. And when this is over, you will still be standing. Too many believers are exhausted, confused, and discouraged, not because God has failed them, but because they're fighting the wrong enemy with the wrong awareness. This is not just about stress. This is not just about people. This is not just about bad luck or hard seasons. This is a spiritual war, and whether you like it or not, you are already in it. The enemy doesn't announce himself. He works subtly, quietly, strategically, and his greatest victory is convincing believers that nothing spiritual is happening at all. What you see on the surface is rarely the full story. Most people interpret life only through what their eyes can see and what their emotions can feel, but the spiritual realm operates beneath the surface, shaping outcomes long before they appear in the natural. When pressure shows up suddenly, when resistance seems disproportionate to the situation, when confusion enters without invitation, it is often because something deeper is happening. The visible battle is usually just the symptom, not the source. If you misidentify the source, you will fight the wrong fight, waste energy, and grow frustrated with people or circumstances that are not actually your enemy. Many believers are worn down, not because they lack faith, but because they keep trying to solve spiritual problems with natural tools. They argue harder, work longer, explain more, defend themselves, and replay conversations in their minds, yet nothing changes. That is because the real battle was never about the conversation, the workload, the finances, or the person. Those things are merely the stage on which the real conflict is playing out. When you only respond to what you can see, you stay reactive instead of discerning. And reactivity always puts you at a disadvantage. The spiritual realm influences the natural realm, whether people acknowledge it or not. Scripture makes it clear that what manifests in the visible world is often first decided in the unseen world. Delays, resistance, and sudden obstacles are not always signs of failure or divine absence. Often, they are evidence that movement has already begun in the spirit. The enemy rarely attacks what has no future. He resists what threatens his territory if there is unusual opposition around your obedience, your calling, or your growth. It may be because something significant is attached to your next step. One of the enemy's greatest tactics is misdirection. If he can convince you that the battle is purely natural, he can keep you fighting shadows. You begin to label people as the problem when they are simply being influenced. You blame systems, timing, or yourself while ignoring the spiritual resistance at work. This does not remove personal responsibility, but it reframes the fight. You stop demonizing people and start discerning forces. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding spiritually. When believers fail to recognize the spiritual nature of the conflict, frustration turns into bitterness and disappointment turns into despair. You start asking why God would allow this when the real question is whether you are seeing the situation clearly. God has not lost control and he is not confused about what is happening. He sees the full picture. The issue is that many believers only see fragments. Partial vision leads to flawed conclusions, and flawed conclusions lead to misplaced battles. Spiritual blindness does not mean the absence of faith. It often means the absence of awareness. You can love God sincerely and still misunderstand what is happening around you. That is why discernment is so critical. Discernment allows you to recognize when something is more than what it appears to be. It helps you pause before reacting and ask what is really going on beneath the surface. Without discernment, you exhaust yourself trying to fix external symptoms while the root remains untouched. The natural mind is wired to seek immediate explanations. It wants quick answers and visible causes. The spiritual mind, however, understands that not everything reveals itself instantly. Some battles are layered. Some resistance is cumulative. Some pressure is strategic. When you encounter repeated obstacles in the same area, it is often a signal that there is more happening than coincidence. Patterns reveal spiritual activity more clearly than isolated events. The enemy thrives in environments where believers are unaware. Ignorance does not remove the battle. It only removes your advantage. When you are unaware of spiritual opposition, you interpret resistance as personal failure. You internalize attacks that were never meant to define you. You question your worth, your calling, and your obedience, when the reality is that the pressure may be confirmation that you are moving in the right direction. Recognizing that the visible battle is not the real battle shifts how you pray. Prayer stops being a desperate plea for relief and becomes a strategic alignment with God's authority. You stop begging God to fix people and start asking Him to strengthen your discernment. You stop praying only for outcomes and start praying for clarity, wisdom, and endurance. When your prayers change, your posture changes, and when your posture changes, your endurance increases. This awareness also changes how you respond to delays. Instead of panicking when things take longer than expected, you begin to understand that delays are not always denials. Sometimes they are indicators of resistance that must be addressed spiritually before progress can manifest naturally. Impatience often causes believers to abandon ground that was already being contested in their favor. The enemy counts on emotional reactions to wear you down before the breakthrough becomes visible. Another danger of misidentifying the battle is misplaced anger. When you believe the fight is against people, resentment grows. Relationships suffer. Unity breaks down. Yet many of those people are not enemies. They are participants in a larger conflict they may not even realize they are part of. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does inform your response. You can address issues firmly without allowing hatred or bitterness to take root, understanding that the real battle is spiritual. Doesn't OT mean you withdraw from practical action. It means your actions are guided by wisdom rather than impulse. You still make decisions, set boundaries, and take responsibility, but you do so with the awareness that prayer, obedience, and alignment with God are not optional accessories. They are essential weapons. Practical steps without spiritual grounding often lead to burnout. Many believers become discouraged because they expect spiritual growth to result in less resistance. In reality, growth often attracts more resistance. As your capacity increases, so does the intensity of the opposition. This is not punishment. It is preparation. The battlefield reveals the weight of what you carry. Light assignments do not require heavy resistance. When the fight intensifies, it is often because your influence is expanding. When you begin to see the battle correctly, fear loses its grip. Fear thrives on confusion and isolation. Discernment brings clarity, and clarity brings stability. You may still feel pressure, but you no longer feel powerless. You understand that what is happening is not random, and that understanding alone restores strength. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what is this trying to stop? Seeing beyond the natural also protects you from spiritual exhaustion. Many believers are tired not because they are doing too much, but because they are fighting without strategy. When you realize the battle is spiritual, you stop trying to control everything and start trusting God to fight what you cannot see. You learn when to act and when to stand. You learn when to speak and when to stay silent. Discernment teaches timing, and timing serves strength. The unseen battle often intensifies right before visible change. This is why so many people quit too early. They interpret increased resistance as a sign to retreat, when it is often a sign that something is shifting. The enemy applies pressure when he senses loss of ground. If you could see what God is already doing behind the scenes, you would understand why the fight feels heavier than before. When believers accept that the visible battle is not the real battle, they stop measuring success by immediate outcomes. Faith becomes less about instant results and more about sustained obedience. You learn to trust that movement is happening even when evidence is delayed. This kind of faith is not passive. It is resilient. It refuses to be shaken by appearances. Spiritual maturity is revealed in how you interpret resistance. Immaturity assumes opposition means failure. Maturity understands opposition often means significance. When you stop personalizing every setback, You protect your identity. Your worth is no longer tied to how smoothly things are going. You understand that difficulty is not always correction. Sometimes it is confirmation. This perspective also guards you against comparison. When you see others advancing without apparent resistance, you may be tempted to question your own path, but different assignments attract different levels of opposition. What you do not see is what they may be facing in other areas. Comparison distorts perception and weakens focus. Discernment keeps you anchored in your own calling. Recognizing the spiritual nature of the battle invites humility. You acknowledge that you do not have full control and that you need God's guidance daily. Pride tries to handle everything independently. Discernment keeps you dependent. Dependence is not weakness, it is alignment. When you are aligned, you stop striving and start standing. This awareness also deepens compassion. When you understand that people are often influenced by forces they do not recognize, your heart softens without becoming passive. You address issues firmly, but you do not carry hatred. You learn to fight the right enemy without destroying relationships unnecessarily. Ultimately, seeing beyond the natural transforms how you endure seasons of pressure. You stop viewing hardship as meaningless pain and start seeing it as contested territory. Every time you choose faith over fear, obedience over emotion, and discernment over reaction, you hold ground that the enemy wanted you to surrender. You may not feel victorious in the moment, but victory is often secured long before it is celebrated. When you finally recognize that the battle you see is not the real battle, your entire posture shifts. You become less frantic and more focused, less reactive and more rooted, less overwhelmed and more aware. The fight does not disappear, but confusion does. And when confusion leaves, strength remains. Weariness is one of the enemy's most effective weapons because it works quietly and gradually. Rarely does it arrive all at once. It builds layer by layer, moment by moment, until a believer wakes up one day feeling spiritually dull, emotionally drained, and mentally overloaded without being able to pinpoint exactly when it started. That is the danger of this strategy. Destruction is loud, but exhaustion is subtle. The enemy understands that if he cannot make you turn your back on God outright, he can still neutralize you by draining your strength until obedience feels heavy and devotion feels optional. Distraction is often the doorway to weariness. The enemy does not always tempt believers with obvious sin. More often, he overwhelms them with noise. Endless responsibilities, constant notifications, relentless opinions, and nonstop urgency pull attention in every direction. None of these things look evil on their own, but together they fracture focus. When focus is fractured, spiritual consistency weakens. Prayer becomes rushed. Scripture becomes occasional. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. Over time, the soul forgets how to rest in God because it has been trained to constantly react. Weariness thrives where rest is misunderstood. Many believers think rest simply means stopping physical activity, but spiritual weariness is not cured by sleep alone. You can be physically rested and still spiritually depleted. True rest comes from alignment, not inactivity. When your soul is misaligned, even good activity drains you. The enemy exploits this by pushing believers into constant motion without presence. You keep moving, serving, producing, and surviving, but you are no longer abiding. Slowly, the inner life becomes dry while the outer life stays busy. Another layer of this strategy is emotional overload. The enemy stirs offense, disappointment, and unresolved pain because emotional weight accelerates exhaustion. When emotions go unprocessed, they pile up internally. A single moment of hurt may be manageable, but accumulated wounds become heavy. You begin carrying things God never asked you to carry. Instead of casting burdens onto him, you rehearse them in your mind. The more you replay them, the heavier they become, and heaviness always drains strength. The enemy also uses time as a weapon. He stretches battles longer than expected, not necessarily to win them outright, but to test endurance. Waiting becomes tiring when expectations are unmet. When prayers are delayed, discouragement whispers that nothing is happening. The longer the silence feels, the louder the doubt becomes. Weariness grows in the gap between promise and fulfillment when perspective is lost. The enemy hopes that prolonged waiting will convince you to lower your expectations or abandon your hope altogether. One of the most dangerous aspects of weariness is that it dulls spiritual sensitivity. When you are tired, discernment weakens. You become more reactive and less prayerful. Small compromises feel justified because you are too tired to fight. What once troubled your conscience now feels negotiable, not because your values changed, but because your strength diminished. The enemy knows that a tired believer is more vulnerable than a sinful one who is alert. Distraction feeds this vulnerability. When your attention is constantly pulled outward, you lose awareness of what is happening inward. The enemy does not need to remove truth from your life. He only needs to crowd it out. Truth unattended loses its influence. When scripture is no longer meditated on, it becomes information instead of nourishment. When prayer is reduced to emergencies only, intimacy fades. Spiritual disciplines do not disappear suddenly. They erode slowly through neglect. Weariness also distorts perception. When you are tired, everything, G feels heavier than it actually is. Problems feel bigger. Opposition feels stronger. God feels farther away. This does not mean God moved. It means fatigue has clouded your vision. Exhaustion magnifies obstacles and minimizes hope. The enemy relies on this distortion because perception shapes response. When you see everything as overwhelming, withdrawal feels reasonable. Another tactic is isolation. Weariness pushes people inward and away from community. You stop sharing. You stop asking for prayer. You stop explaining what you are going through because it feels like too much effort. Isolation then deepens the exhaustion because strength is often replenished through connection. The enemy understands that discouraged thoughts grow stronger in silence. When struggles remain unspoken, they grow unchecked. The enemy also leverages repetition. Repeated attacks in the same area wear down resistance. Even strong believers can become tired of fighting the same battle over and over. You start asking why this keeps happening, why this area never seems to change. Repetition without visible progress tempts the mind to accept defeat internally, even if outwardly you keep going. This internal surrender is what the enemy is really after. Weariness does not usually announce itself as unbelief. It often disguises itself as practicality. You begin to lower spiritual expectations under the banner of being realistic. You pray less boldly, not because you no longer believe God can act, but because you are tired of hoping. You stop expecting breakthrough and start managing disappointment. This shift feels protective, but it slowly drains faith of its vitality. The enemy also attacks through comparison during seasons of weariness. When you are tired, seeing others advance can feel discouraging rather than inspiring. You begin to question why your progress seems slower or your battles heavier. Comparison intensifies exhaustion because it adds unnecessary emotional strain. It pulls focus away from your assignment and places it on someone else's path. The enemy uses this distraction to weaken resolve. Another layer of this strategy is guilt. When believers feel weary, they often feel ashamed of it. They believe they should be stronger, more joyful, more consistent. This shame prevents them from bringing their exhaustion to God honestly. Instead of seeking renewal, they hide their fatigue behind spiritual language. The enemy exploits this by keeping weariness hidden where it can deepen without intervention. The enemy also uses success to create weariness. When God begins to move, responsibilities increase, opportunities multiply, expectations grow. Without intentional grounding, success can become draining. The enemy does not mind believers being active as long as they are disconnected from the source of their strength. Activity without intimacy eventually leads to burnout. Burnout then creates vulnerability, even in fruitful seasons. Weariness affects decision-making. Tired minds choose relief over wisdom. Short-term comfort begins to outweigh long-term obedience. You become more likely to avoid difficult but necessary choices. The enemy leverages this fatigue to delay obedience, knowing that delayed obedience often becomes abandoned obedience. What you postpone long enough, you may eventually let go of. Distraction also affects prayer language. When enos sets in, prayer becomes repetitive and surface level. You pray out of habit rather than hunger. The heart is present, but the soul is tired. Over time, prayer feels less effective, not because God stopped listening, but because your engagement has diminished. The enemy wants prayer to feel boring, ineffective, or exhausting so that you reduce it voluntarily. The strategy of weariness also targets hope. Hope requires energy. It requires imagination, expectation, and trust. When you are tired, hope feels risky. Disappointment hurts more when strength is low. So the enemy convinces believers to stop hoping as a form of self-protection. But when hope dies, endurance follows. You may continue functioning, but you stop advancing. The enemy's goal is not always to make you quit publicly. Often he is content if you quit privately. You still attend, you still serve, you still speak the language of faith, but inwardly you have disengaged. Your heart is no longer fully in it. This quiet resignation is dangerous because it is harder to detect and easier to justify. Weariness also impacts worship. What once flowed freely now feels forced. Praise becomes effort instead of overflow. The enemy knows that worship shifts atmosphere and restores perspective, so he attacks the desire to worship by making it feel heavy. When worship diminishes, spiritual sensitivity dulls further, creating a cycle that feeds itself. Another tactic is urgency without priority. Everything feels important, so nothing feels sacred. The enemy keeps believers busy with immediate demands, so they neglect eternal focus. When everything is urgent, discernment suffers. You respond to what is loudest instead of what is most important. Over time, this constant urgency drains strength and erodes peace. Weariness also creates vulnerability to offense. When tired, patience runs thin. Small frustrations feel bigger. Grace feels harder to extend. The enemy uses offense to fracture relationships because broken relationships drain emotional energy. Unresolved conflict keeps the soul restless. Restlessness then feeds exhaustion. The enemy understands that weariness does not remove calling, but it can delay fulfillment. A tired believer still has purpose, but lacks momentum. The strategy is not to erase destiny, but to slow it down. Delay creates frustration, and frustration creates temptation to compromise. The enemy hopes that prolonged fatigue will cause believers to settle for less than what God intended. Distraction and weariness together create spiritual numbness. You still believe, but you no longer feel alive. Passion fades, zeal cools. This numbness is not sudden. It develops through prolonged neglect of renewal. The enemy prefers numb believers over rebellious ones because numbness draws less attention. Weariness also affects trust. When tired, it is harder to trust unseen outcomes. Faith requires strength to wait. The enemy knows that if he can drain your strength, waiting becomes unbearable. You start seeking control because trust feels too costly. Control then increases stress, which deepens weariness. The enemy's strategy succeeds when believers normalize exhaustion as a permanent state. When weariness becomes identity, renewal feels unrealistic. You stop believing rest is possible, but this normalization is a lie. Weariness is a condition, not a calling. It is a now, not a destiny. The most dangerous part of weariness is that it often feels justified. You have reasons, you have responsibilities, you have pressures. All of them are real. But justification does not heal exhaustion. Only realignment does. The enemy wants you to believe that this level of depletion is simply the price of faithfulness. Weariness dulls hunger for God, not because love is gone, but because strength is low. When strength is restored, hunger often returns. That is why the enemy fights renewal so aggressively. He knows that a rested believer is dangerous, focused, discerning, and resilient. The longer weariness goes unaddressed, the more normal it feels. You forget what joy felt like. You forget what clarity felt like. You forget what peace felt like. The enemy relies on this forgetting. When memory of wholeness fades, desire for restoration weakens. Weariness does not mean God is absent. Often it means the battle has intensified. The enemy applies pressure where resistance matters. Fatigue is often evidence that you have been standing longer than you realize, and the fact that you are still standing, even tired, means the strategy has not fully succeeded. One of the most common mistakes believers make in spiritual conflict is assuming that passion can replace posture. There is a deep temptation to think that if you care enough, try hard enough, or push long enough, victory will come. But spiritual warfare was never designed to be fought with human intensity alone. Effort without alignment drains quickly. Strength without surrender collapses under pressure. God never called you to win by overpowering the battle. He called you to win by abiding in Him. The desire to handle things in your own strength often comes from a sincere place. You want relief. You want resolution. You want movement. When pressure builds, the instinct to take control kicks in. You analyze more, plan harder, defend yourself quicker, and push through exhaustion because stopping feels like losing. But self-reliance, even when motivated by good intentions, becomes a liability in spiritual warfare. The moment you rely primarily on yourself, you step outside the flow of divine strength. Human strength has limits that spiritual battles are designed to expose. These conflicts are not meant to be conquered by willpower. They are structured to bring you to the end of yourself so that you discover the sufficiency of God. When you try to fight in your own strength, frustration increases because the battle resists human solutions. No amount of logic, argument, or determination can replace the authority that comes from surrender. There is a subtle pride and self-reliance that often goes unnoticed. It does not always look arrogant. Sometimes it looks responsible. You feel it is up to you to fix things, hold everything together, and carry the weight. But carrying what God never assigned to you leads to burnout. God's strength flows where dependence is acknowledged. When you refuse to release control, you block access to the very power you need. Spiritual battles require spiritual authority, not emotional intensity. Authority comes from alignment, not effort. When you are aligned with God's will, timing, and instruction, His power operates through you. When you act independently, even with passion, you step into resistance without covering. This is why some battles feel unnecessarily hard. You are swinging hard, but not standing in position. Many believers confuse activity with obedience. They assume that as long as they are doing something, they are moving forward. But obedience is not about motion, it is about submission. Sometimes obedience looks like waiting. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Fighting in your own strength often ignores these subtleties because the flesh prefers action over trust. Self-effort also fuels emotional reactions. When you believe it is all on you, every setback feels personal. Frustration turns into anger. Delays turn into anxiety. Criticism feels like an attack on your identity. This emotional volatility is exhausting and counterproductive. When you surrender the outcome to God, your emotions settle because your confidence is no longer rooted in your performance. Another danger of fighting in your own strength is misusing words. In spiritual warfare, words carry weight. When spoken from fear, frustration, or pride, they often reinforce the problem rather than resolve it. Speaking without surrender leads to venting instead of declaring. The enemy thrives on careless speech because it reveals internal unrest. Surrendered strength, however, produces measured, purposeful words. The illusion of control is particularly dangerous in prolonged battles. When progress is slow, the urge to force outcomes grows stronger. You try to accelerate timelines, manipulate circumstances, or pressure people, thinking urgency will produce results. But forced outcomes often create new problems. God's strength operates through trust in His timing. Impatience reveals where self-reliant has replaced surrender. Fighting in your own strength also distorts prayer. Prayer becomes a monologue instead of a dialogue. You tell God what you want, how you want it, and when you want it. Listening decreases because anxiety dominates. Surrendered prayer, on the other hand, creates space for instruction. You stop using prayer to inform God and start using it to align yourself. Another sign of self-reliance is resistance to rest. Rest feels unproductive when you believe everything depends on you. You keep going even when depleted because stopping feels irresponsible. But rest is not laziness, it is an act of trust. Rest declares that God is at work even when you are not. The enemy fears rested believers because rest restores clarity and renews strength. Fighting in your own strength also increases vulnerability to offense. When you carry the weight alone, you expect others to understand and support you perfectly. When they fail, disappointment deepens. But when your strength comes from God, people's responses no longer determine your stability. You become less reactive and more resilient. The enemy exploits self-reliance because it isolates you from divine help. When you think you must handle everything, you stop asking, seeking, and knocking with humility. Pride does not always say, I don't need God. Sometimes it says, I'll pray, but I'll handle the rest. This divided dependence weakens spiritual authority. God's strength is not activated by desperation alone. It is activated by surrender. Surrender is not giving up. It is giving over. It is the conscious decision to trust God's wisdom above your own instincts. When you surrender, you stop striving to control all outcomes and start cooperating with God's process. Cooperation releases grace. Striving resists it. Many believers fear surrender because they equate it with passivity. They worry that letting go means doing nothing. But surrender is not inactivity, it is alignment. It positions you to act when God instructs and to stand when he says wait. This precision preserves energy and increases effectiveness. When you fight in your own strength, you measure progress by visible results. When you fight in God's strength, you measure progress by obedience. Obedience keeps you grounded when results are delayed. It protects you from discouragement and pride alike. Success no longer inflates you and delay no longer crushes you. Self-reliance also leads to comparison. When you depend on your own strength, you measure yourself against others to assess progress. Comparison breeds insecurity or arrogance, both of which drain spiritual strength. Surrender refocuses you on God's assignment for your life, not someone else's timeline. The enemy wants believers to exhaust themselves because exhaustion weakens resistance. A tired believer is easier to discourage, distract, and deceive. Fighting in God's strength preserves endurance. His strength renews rather than drains. It does not depend on circumstances. It flows from relationship. Another consequence of self-effort is inconsistency. Human strength fluctuates. Some days you feel strong, other days you feel weak. When your spiritual posture depends on your energy level, your stability becomes unpredictable. God's strength, however, remains constant. When you learn to rely on him, your steadiness increases even when emotions vary. Fighting in God's strength also reshapes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as the source and start seeing yourself as a vessel. This removes pressure and restores joy. You are no longer trying to prove anything. You simply remain available. Availability invites divine involvement. Surrendered strength teaches patience. You understand that some battles are won over time, not instantly. You stop rushing the process and start trusting the outcome. Patience is not passive. It is disciplined trust. The enemy cannot easily manipulate someone who is patient because patience resists pressure. Another critical aspect is learning to say no. When you fight in your own strength, you overcommit. You feel obligated to meet every demand, but surrender brings discernment. You recognize that not every opportunity is an assignment. Saying no preserves strength for what truly matters. Fighting in God's strength also deepens humility. You acknowledge that without him, you can do nothing of lasting value. This humility does not weaken you, it strengthens you. God resists pride, but supplies grace to the humble. Grace is the unseen force that carries you when your strength runs out. The enemy often provokes believers to react quickly. Reaction is fueled by emotion. Response is guided by discernment. When you rely on God's strength, you slow down enough to respond wisely. Slowness in reaction often prevents costly mistakes. Self-reliance also narrows vision. You focus on immediate relief rather than long-term transformation. God's strength expands vision. He sees beyond the battle to the purpose it is producing in you. When you trust him, you stop fighting just to escape and start enduring. To grow. The longer you fight in your own strength, the more likely you are to confuse perseverance with stubbornness. Perseverance follows God's lead. Stubbornness resists adjustment. Surrender keeps you flexible. It allows God to redirect without resistance. Fighting in God's strength transforms pressure into formation. What once felt overwhelming becomes refining. You stop asking how to escape and start asking what God is building. This shift brings peace even in difficulty. The enemy fears believers who are surrendered because surrender makes room for God's power. Power flows where control is released. When you stop trying to be strong enough, you finally become positioned to receive strength that does not fail. In the end, the realization that you were never meant to fight in your own strength changes everything. The battle does not disappear, but the burden lifts. You are no longer carrying the weight alone, and that awareness itself becomes a turning point in the war. Standing your ground is one of the most misunderstood aspects of spiritual warfare because it does not look dramatic. There is no sudden movement, no visible progress, no emotional rush that signals victory. Standing feels slow, quiet, and often unrewarded in the moment. That is why many believers struggle with it. The flesh prefers action because action feels productive, but standing requires trust, and trust stretches patience. Yet in spiritual warfare, standing is not passive. It is one of the most aggressive acts of faith. When pressure increases, the instinct is to do something, anything, to change the situation. You want movement because movement feels like control. Standing, however, asks you to confront the reality that some battles are not won by advancing, but by refusing to retreat. Retreat does not always look like walking away. Sometimes it looks like compromising convictions, lowering standards, adjusting truth to ease pressure, or agreeing internally with fear and doubt, even while outwardly maintaining appearance. Standing your ground means you refuse to surrender territory that God has already given you, even when resistance intensifies. The enemy often attacks hardest where ground has already been gained. He is not always trying to push you backward as much as he is trying to wear you down enough that you step back voluntarily. Standing says, I will not move even if nothing changes yet. That kind of resolve disrupts the enemy's strategy because it removes urgency and replaces it with endurance. Standing requires clarity of identity. If you do not know who you are, pressure will define you. Opposition will begin to shape how you see yourself. You will interpret resistance as proof that you are wrong, unqualified, or out of alignment. Standing rejects that narrative. It anchors identity in truth rather than circumstance. You remain rooted in who God says you are, even when everything around you argues otherwise. There is discomfort in standing because it exposes insecurity. Movement allows distraction. Standing forces reflection. When you stand, you become aware of doubts you might otherwise outrun. Fear surfaces. Questions arise. Uncertainty grows louder. The enemy uses this moment to whisper that standing is pointless. But the discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are confronting what must be settled internally before victory manifests externally. Standing your ground also confronts impatience. We live in a culture that rewards speed and immediate results. Spiritual warfare often defies that pace. Progress is not always visible and outcomes are not always instant. Standing requires you to believe that something is happening even when you cannot see it. This belief is not blind optimism. It is trust in the faithfulness of God beyond sensory evidence. Many believers confuse standing with stagnation. They assume that if nothing is changing outwardly, nothing is happening inwardly. But standing produces internal transformation. It strengthens resolve, deepens trust, and refines obedience. While nothing may appear to shift on the surface, something is being secured beneath it. The enemy understands this, which is why he pressures believers to abandon their position prematurely. Standing also involves resisting emotional manipulation. Feelings fluctuate under pressure. One day you feel confident, the next day uncertain. Standing does not deny emotion, but it refuses to be led by it. You acknowledge fear without obeying it. You feel discouragement without surrendering to it. Emotional discipline becomes a form of warfare because it prevents temporary feelings from dictating permanent decisions. There is a cost to standing because it often invites misunderstanding. People may question why you are not reacting, adjusting, or moving on. Silence can be misinterpreted as weakness. Patience can be mistaken for passivity. Standing requires confidence that does not need validation. You stop explaining yourself to those who cannot discern the season you are in. This restraint preserves strength. Standing your ground also means maintaining integrity under pressure. Compromise often presents itself as a shortcut to relief. You are offered easier paths that promise immediate comfort at the expense of long-term alignment. Standing refuses those shortcuts. It chooses faithfulness over convenience. Integrity becomes a shield that protects you from regret, even when the battle lasts longer than expected. The enemy relies on escalation to provoke reaction. When standing frustrates him, he intensifies pressure. The goal is to force movement through discomfort. Many believers mistake escalation as a sign that standing is ineffective. In reality, escalation often means standing is working. Resistance increases when the enemy senses he is losing leverage. Standing denies him access to emotional volatility, which is one of his favorite tools. Standing also preserves spiritual authority. Authority is not demonstrated by noise or motion. It is demonstrated by position. When you remain in position, aligned with truth and obedience, authority remains intact. When you step out of position through fear or compromise, authority weakens. Standing protects position, and position sustains authority. Another challenge of standing is the temptation to self-justify. When nothing changes, the mind looks for explanations. You may begin to question whether you misunderstood God or misread the situation. Discernment is required here. Standing does not mean refusing correction, but it does mean refusing condemnation. There's a difference between divine adjustment and enemy accusation. Standing keeps you open to God while closed to lies. Standing your ground also exposes hidden attachments. When everything else is stripped away and you are left waiting, you discover what you truly depend on. If peace disappears when outcomes delay, it reveals misplaced trust. Standing allows God to realign priorities and strengthen foundations. What feels like delay is often refinement. One of the hardest aspects of standing is enduring silence. Silence can feel like abandonment if you interpret it incorrectly, but silence is often strategic. It forces you to rely on what God has already said rather than seeking constant reassurance. Standing trains you to live from conviction instead of emotion. Conviction sustains when feelings fluctuate. Standing also builds spiritual muscle. Endurance is not developed through quick victories, but through prolonged resistance. Every moment you remain faithful under pressure strengthens your capacity to handle greater responsibility. Standing prepares you for what comes next by proving you can be trusted with weight. The enemy wants you to believe that standing wastes time. He whispers that you are falling behind, missing opportunities, or being left out. Standing counters this by trusting divine timing over personal urgency. You understand that rushing ahead can be just as damaging as falling back. Standing keeps you in step with God rather than ahead of him. Standing your ground requires discernment between what to resist and what to release. Not everything is meant to be fought. Some things are meant to be surrendered. Standing does not mean clinging to control. It means remaining obedient. You stand on truth, not on personal preference. This distinction protects you from stubbornness disguised as faith. There is also a relational oath to standing. Not everyone will understand your posture. Some will pressure you to move, adjust, or settle. Standing may create distance, but that distance often reveals alignment. Those who are meant to walk with you will respect your obedience, even if they do not fully understand it. Standing strengthens testimony even before words are spoken. Consistency under pressure speaks louder than declarations. When others see you unmoved by fear, unchanged by opposition, and unwavering in integrity, it challenges their assumptions. Standing becomes a silent witness of trust in God's sovereignty. Another dimension of standing is resisting internal retreat. You may remain outwardly consistent while inwardly disengaging. Standing requires both internal and external alignment. You guard your thoughts, expectations, and beliefs. You refuse to let cynicism replace hope. Internal retreat often precedes external collapse. Standing also redefines success. Success is no longer measured by immediate outcomes, but by faithfulness. You begin to see endurance as progress. Every day you remain obedient is a victory, even if circumstances remain unchanged. This perspective stabilizes you when results delay. The enemy thrives on instability. Standing frustrates him because it removes chaos from the equation. Chaos creates opportunity for deception. Stability limits his influence. When you stand, you reduce variables. You become predictable in obedience, which is dangerous to the enemy. Standing your ground also requires trust in God's justice. You resist the urge to vindicate yourself prematurely. You allow God to defend what he has established. This restraint preserves peace and prevents unnecessary battles. Not every accusation deserves a response. Some battles are won by silence. Standing develops spiritual maturity because it requires balance. You learn when to speak and when to wait, when to act and when to remain still. This balance comes only through experience. Standing provides that experience by stretching discernment. There is a refining loneliness in standing. It can feel isolating because it strips away distractions and forces focus. But this solitude often deepens intimacy with God. When other supports fade, reliance increases. Standing strengthens relationship, not because it feels comforting, but because it builds trust. Standing also dismantles fear's authority. Fear thrives on movement driven by panic. When you stand, fear loses leverage. It cannot force you into reaction. Over time, fear weakens because its threats go unanswered. Standing teaches fear that it does not control your decisions. Standing your ground honors the work God has already done. Retreat suggests doubt in what has been established. Standing affirms trust in past obedience. You refuse to invalidate previous steps just because the journey became difficult. This continuity preserves momentum even in stillness. Standing is often the final test before breakthrough. The enemy applies pressure not because he is winning, but because he is running out of options. If you can be moved, he will move you. If you cannot, he must retreat. Standing removes his leverage. Stand. Ding also clarifies priorities. When everything else is stripped away, what remains matters most. Standing simplifies faith. It removes excess and focuses on essentials, trust, obedience, and endurance. Standing your ground does not mean you feel strong. Often it means you feel weak but remain obedient anyway. Strength is not always the absence of weakness. Sometimes it is faithfulness in spite of it. Standing honors God not because it is impressive, but because it is costly. Standing teaches you that victory is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, slow, and unseen until suddenly it is undeniable. When victory comes, it often feels inevitable in hindsight, not dramatic in the moment. Standing makes room for that kind of victory. Standing your ground is the refusal to surrender truth to pressure, identity to fear, or obedience to exhaustion. It is the quiet, relentless choice to remain where God placed you, trusting that he is at work even when you are not moving. This war is real, but so is God's power. The fight is intense, but so is his faithfulness. The enemy is active, but God is undefeated. So lift your head, tighten your grip, strengthen your faith. You are not a victim in this battle. You are not unarmed. You are not alone. This is a spiritual war, and you were born for victory,